Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. In this episode, I'm joined by not one, but two ex-colleagues of mine who both recently retired from long careers in conservation and who I regard as pioneers in the field. They both headed biodiversity departments in city governments, Widar Narvelo at Helsingborg in Sweden and Grant Pearsell at Edmonton in Canada. I met Grant and Widar when they joined a project that I was involved in and which is mentioned in our discussion called Local Action for Biodiversity, and they've had a really positive and inspirational effect on my life ever since. Our discussion focuses on the lessons and experience that Grant and Widar had gathered over a collective of about 80 years of biodiversity conservation, starting in the days when this field barely existed. Before starting, just a quick apology for the sound quality in places. It's not too bad, but having two guests turned out to have a couple of additional technical challenges. I'll be back at the end just to briefly introduce next month's guest. Let me start off by asking each of you, and I'll start with you, maybe Widar, how you became interested in conservation and how you ended up pursuing the career that you chose.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but it started in my childhood as for many others. My parents were very interested in going out in nature, and we had this, the right of public access. I think you have that in Canada too.
For some places, yes.
Everywhere, in private forests and everywhere. So
no, we don't have that.
That's a very good thing, I think. So we were very much out and picking berries and mushrooms and just walking in nature and so on. And so I had this interest. And when the gymnasium was finished, I went to the University of Lund. I had some work in between, but I came to the university, and under 5 years I studied different natural sciences such as chemistry and ecology and geology and so on. But it took some time to find just about conservation. I read about a girl who contacted a municipality and said, I want to do some practice in your community and so on. And later she got a full-time job. So I thought, oh, that's the way you should do it. Just call a community and ask for doing a practice and so on. So I did the same. And after some years, I got a job. It was an architect who was a comprehensive planner. Thought it was very important to have this kind of knowledge. So I was employed full-time in 1987.
Mm-hmm. Grant, over to you. Can you tell us how you got into the work that you just retired from?
Similar path at the beginning. My family would go camping, and we did a lot of that. I was pretty much a free-range kid and would run around in nature, and when I was back at home, I would do the same. So that gave me a kind of a grounding and an orientation to it. But as I started to think about a career, I was a little bit lost in my early days, and I had to pick a direction, and I thought, this new thing was coming out, the environment. And I thought that would be a good career direction to go into. So this was in the 70s. And I'd started to meet some people, and I'd sort of declared that's what I was going to do. But I didn't know how I was going to do it. So I took some education in civil engineering, which led me into protecting the environment at a hard rock mining company. That ended because of the economy, but I resurfaced at a company called Ducks Unlimited Canada, which is a conservation group in Canada, and Ducks Unlimited in North is in the United States. So it's a continental-wide conservation group. And that gave me the exposure to that there was a field called conservation and you could work in it. Up to then, we didn't really know that was something that a person could do. So I was doing wetland hydrology, hydraulics, but then I started to get interested in the whole field a little bit more and thinking, what else could I do? And some of the projects I realized you actually needed skills in another discipline within urban planning, and some more science would be useful. So I went back to school and learned that. Subsequently, went to Edmonton, and whenever I saw the chief planner for the City of Edmonton, I would ask if he'd started a job for someone in conservation. And he'd say, no, not yet. And it went on for a couple of years. And then one day he said, yes, we're going to have a position. And then we started. And that was the first one in our city, was just at the Millennium.
So both of you ended up in conservation in the city context. That's one thing that you have very much in common. Grant, how would you describe the overarching goals of your work at the City of Edmonton? Were your sort of personal goals or the goals of your department, were those very different from the city government more broadly, or did they kind of fit in quite nicely with the direction the city was going?
Well, this position that I applied for and was successful came as a result of quite a big issue in our city, where a very important natural area was argued about whether it should be protected or not and how it could be protected. And it was really not a municipal authority in order to do this. There's not many enabling legislation that would allow a municipality to do so. And so council sort of wiped their hands of it and said, we're not going to do anything. Then it was knocked down. There was huge protests. There was mock funerals. There was lots of, theater around this. And it was the city at that point decided we're going to go in a new direction. And so when we started, we didn't quite know what to do. Like, where do we start? There was no kind of program. There was no sort of provincial support. Federal government has no authority over municipalities, or very little in Canada. So we were just starting and trying to figure out what we wanted to do and what we should do, given the situation we had. So we just started from a very beginner's place and went from there. Over time, we did get a lot more alignment, and that had a lot to do with how we conceptualized how ecology would fit into our city. What we realized is we were looking at to protect nature. We're getting a lot of reaction from the transportation engineers and the water resource engineers, that what we wanted to do would ruin the characteristics and the performance of their system, the transportation system, the drainage system. And I thought, well, we have a system too. It's our natural systems. And so we worked hard to get into the official plans of the city, and any plan that we could that brought into that systems approach. And then that brought in a different kind of discussion with the different disciplines. Like, my system characteristics needs this, my system needs this, my system needs that. And so that collaboration was able to work together to see what things could be compatible, what things are not compatible. And then the solutions that came out of that were actually quite organic. And we had to sort of do that. I think it's important to note, 20, 25 years ago, this was not a subject that was really acceptable for academics to study. I went to the university and I thought I could get lots of people to maybe help me, point us in the right direction. They didn't really have any orientation, and it was explained to me by many people that this was not a serious topic for academic study and they could not advance their careers. So then we had to come up with, okay, what do we do given that hand? So it has come quite a ways. And I just want to give a tribute to, although, there appears to be conflict, but it's people fighting for the thing that they're responsible for. And so I just think that people have come a long ways and have really expanded how they think about what the purpose of a city is through this work. Yeah.
Widar, I wanted to ask you the same question. How you would describe the overarching goals of your work, and just kind of also to contrast your personal goals or the goals of your group with the general goals of the city. Like, were they aligned, or was there conflict there?
At the time I was employed in the 80s, there was new legislation. The planning and building law came in 1997, and the law of natural resources was established at the same time. So there was a need for many municipalities to employ ecologists. But today, of the 290 municipalities, perhaps 1/3 has employed ecologists. And the overarching goals of our work is to save important green structures in the comprehensive plan. I was employed at the Department of Comprehensive Planning and been there all the time. So that was the fundamental work, and also to make a nature conservation plan. So that was done in 1992. From that, the law was changed again so that municipalities were able to create own nature reserves. So me and my colleagues, I must say, I was alone until year 2000, and later on, new ecologists have been employed too. So now there's 8 new colleagues. If I also count the climate adaptation person and the water wetland planning person. So it was much new laws that says we must work for sustainability, and then the environmental code came and became even stronger to make sustainable planning. So it has all the time been more and more legislation that are important. So we have also the European Union legislation. So altogether we have much support from legislation. Therefore, the overarching goals of the work from political view has to follow this. But that doesn't mean there was no conflicts. There are some projects that threatens important green areas, of course. So the exploitation interests are always, as we all know, crucial things to handle. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it could be a new road or building housing areas or whatever, but we can prevent much of that in the comprehensive plan. So therefore, it's a very important instrument.
Mm-hmm. Over the course of your career as a whole, what has been the most difficult challenge?
Well, in a political organization, as we've been working here, it's to stand up for conservation issues when there is exploitation interests, and they always claim money and economy and so on. And I've tried to claim monetary values in biodiversity, but it's not so easy as you know. Sometimes you have to have courage to stand up for these issues, but there are many other things you have to be aware of, and of course good knowledge about the whole thing, you know, geology, limnology, ecology and so on, biodiversity and the landscape itself. To build up good argument has been a challenge, but I think Grant can agree we are rather good at that now, I think. So yeah.
Let's hand over to Grant and hear what's the Edmonton experience. What's been your most difficult challenge? What comes to mind?
Our most difficult challenge, or my most difficult challenge, I think, I alluded to in my initial remarks, but it is, what does urban conservation mean? What does protecting urban biodiversity mean? You can't be completely pure because you're a city. We had to confront a lot of questions. The science was not there at the time, so you had to take the science you could. Maybe it was more along first principles and then apply them. But a lot of things that were common and accepted in conservation biology couldn't work in a city, and so you had to work that out. And so I think that was the most difficult. And as Widar had said, you come up with an argument or the vision, or you have to communicate to people to show them what you're trying to do, and then get as many people as you can to support you. And so that's the direction we went. But, things started to catch up on the science side, and there was more work coming in. There was the work from Local Action for Biodiversity. That was very good to get out in the world and see what others were doing and seeing what could work and not work. But the other side, sort of opposite to Widar, and it's a nice sort of juxtaposition, we didn't really have many regulatory authority to do much of anything. It was not something that the provincial government put any rules in. We didn't have much in our planning legislation that allowed environmental protection. In fact, some things we just couldn't do, our lawyers advised us, because protecting the environment was not considered a valid municipal purpose. Like, that was for other orders of government. And so these are rules that have come back, when we were basically a colonial settlement of what municipalities should do. Mm-hmm. So that was the hand we were dealt. But what I learned is everybody's dealt a hand, and it's different, and you just have to figure out how to do it. And I think we did. And part of the thing is, I'm not saying we should have had regulations. It was more of our culture here that is don't trust regulation or don't like regulation so much. But it doesn't mean they don't like the outcomes that regulations can give you. So if you can find another way to do it, I think you're going to get a much better support. And that gives you more of an honest conversation with someone who is trying to make whatever their particular goals are in city building. And compared to yours, you have to sort it out. You can't just say, here's the rule, here's the boss, I rule by the rule. I think that ultimately gives you poorer outcomes because it doesn't allow the creativity, doesn't allow you to think outside the box. It makes you refer back to what some legislator said somewhere along the line is the best thing to do in a field that is rapidly changing. So,
when do you think the ecosystem services argument came in as a useful tool in that toolbox?
I don't think it's ever come as a useful argument in my experience. In our cultural setting, it turns people off when they hear eco anything. There's a certain part of the population that's just going to tune out. So we had a very successful open space, parks and open space plan. And right at the heart of it is it's about ecosystem services, but we didn't call them ecosystem services. We called them functions. And everybody was okay with that. Like, the whole sort of noise went away. So I think it's using the language of whoever is maybe nervous about what you're proposing and not go with this established jargon, which is rooted in academia, most likely, or in some sort of government organization, and using language that's just more common to everybody to figure it out. So useful concept, but hard to bring people on just as an argument. I recently told somebody, I've never been successful on a project using a scientific argument. Now, I've used science a lot, but one of the things I've learned over the years is just because you know something or science knows something or wherever that authority is, that is not enough to convince something to do something for someone that's either against their values or against their own self-interest or the interest of their group.
That's interesting. So I asked just now about the most difficult challenge, but Grant, what about the most rewarding achievement looking back on your career in the City of Edmonton?
One of the most rewarding experiences just recently. Now, I've left the city and there's still controversies and people are saying, come out, Grant, you come out to council and say your say, maybe you can sway them, whatever. And I thought, I've got to leave this. I'm just one person. Other people have to pick up the baton and carry it on. But what I really resonated, I was listening in on a council situation and where there was a very contentious debate in the community about whether we should knock down, destroy some nature to put solar panels or not. And so we had two sides of the same issue. And just to hear so many citizens coming up and arguing for the protection of the ecological system of the city. 20 years ago, no one would have said system. No citizen would have come in and talked about an ecological system. And so that was very gratifying. Back in the day, we just wanted to protect one natural area and didn't think that it related to anything or connected to anything else. And so that was hard for people to understand. The biologists didn't understand that we were related to. So it took a lot of sort of evolution of thinking, and it did change the dynamic of the conversation that the city had. And it's not just me. I had a team that worked like really hard. And they were able to bring this argument forward and this sort of way of thinking that is now part of our culture of our city. And the reason I think it was sad, it felt good to me, is because now it's a sort of another generation. It seems like it's normal now. There's some normality to it. It's not completely normal, but there is some normality to it.
Mm-hmm. And Widar, what about you as far as rewarding achievements are concerned?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's about having started this green thinking in the comprehensive plan in the 80s. And I participated in 5 master comprehensive plans because they regularly has to be redone. And also, I was alone for almost 15, 20 years, and right now there's 8 new colleagues. So perhaps that's a result also of a raised awareness about sustainability issues, I think, and also legislation, as I mentioned before. And then we had the Nature Conservation Plan I made in 1992, which was the instrument for priority of making local nature reserves. We have 10 nature reserves, and of course my colleagues are also involved in this. And we have 10 nature reserves made by the regional authority. So we have 20 local nature reserves, but we can make 20 more. And then also we started to create wetlands since we are dominated by farmlands. About 70% of the area is farmlands, and wetlands were drained in the 1850s. So it was a very dry area. We have no lakes, we have small rivers, and now we have created over 100 smaller wetlands. And also I started the work with the climate adaptation. I got a task to make a climate adaptation memorandum done in 2012. So that's, I think, the main awarding things. The physical imprint in the landscape, I think, is most important.
And it sounds like you've told me before that Helsingborg, even though it's a relatively small city in Sweden, the environmental work has received a disproportionate number of awards and recognitions. That must help you a lot, right, to kind of keep you motivated?
Yeah, absolutely, and all colleagues too. And I think the politicians need to hear that. Then they get proud, even though they not always work for supporting sustainability issues. They are very proud when they got this ranking. So Helsingborg has got this best of sustainability in Sweden 5 times out of 11, and also second best in conservation and best bee community. We made a lot of new meadows for haymaking and so on. So it helps a lot of flowers and butterflies and bees and so on. So it's a special award, best bee community.
Have you seen kind of a change in attitude, like Grant was saying, has happened in Edmonton, a change in the attitude of the general citizenry and perhaps also the city government officials outside your department?
Yeah, I can see it has been stronger. We have very active NGOs, BirdLife NGO and Nature Conservation NGO and so on. So they are very on all the time to see what happens in the community. So yeah, it has. But in the same time, there's right now on the national level a conflict politically. We have a general protection of the coastline. And some politicians want to break that up so you can build houses along the shores around lakes and the sea and so on. And also about the forest, because we chop down too much old forest. So at the same time, yes, there is raised awareness about conservation issues, but there's also big pressure to build and develop and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Similar situation to what we have. You know, there's a pressure to build the city a certain way, and can often be perceived that protecting nature goes against the interests of what a good city is. Now, the opposite viewpoint is there as well, like it's completely in alignment with what a good city is. I did want to just echo something that Widar had mentioned about the official plan. What we call official plan, I think you call it a master plan or your top plan in your city. That was a big success for us that did set us on a better trajectory when we got it into our highest level plans. And, you know, we started thinking about it. We had done a conservation plan, and everybody was pretty excited, pretty happy. Everybody was congratulating each other on the day it was finally approved. It was unanimous by council. But then it starts to fade from people's minds. What was that plan again? You know, because you're on to the next thing. It's your affordable housing, it's your homelessness, it's safety, it's whatever it might be. And it starts to just recede, and people don't know what that plan was about, and they don't go back and look at it. So we concluded we had to be front and center in the official plan. And we worked hard to get that done. And that really did set us on a better path. It set us to considering all these issues way further in front of the decision making than we normally did. You know, we had been in a situation where, you know, development is going to council for approval, and then somebody shows up and says, I don't like it. And so it's been years in making, and there's no point. So it gets so frustrating and difficult to communicate. So by getting it into that official plan early on really helped us set the direction and keep it legitimate. And I would say it was really felt worthwhile, that this was a worthwhile idea, how we have framed it, because we now have a new official plan prepared by different people, and these ideas carry on into our next official plan.
Yeah, what the Grant mentioned before about the difficulty of using words like ecosystem and biodiversity and so on. And sometimes, we recognize that too here. And sometimes you could use climate adaptation as a door opener. And then since there are so much solutions in the ecosystem for mitigation and so on. And we could also talk about health rather than biodiversity. We could also talk about the circumstances for children and their development, the need for nature for development of the brain and so on. There are medical research about that support that. So sometimes we use that kind of argument instead for saying biodiversity.
How do you actually get those messages to the general public?
Yeah, there's a lot of different possibilities. When we are doing something that is going through the Planning and Building Committee, it often gets public directly, so papers can call and ask questions and so on. But we also have a very lot of nature guidance for the public. So in those occasions, we can tell as much as we can about ecosystem services and so on. And it could be when you are making presentations in different situations, there is a lot of alternative, because that's a very important question in itself, because if you don't get the public supporting, they can make pressure on the politicians. I can just mention a current case. It's about an old deciduous forest. It's just 30 hectares, but it contains very rich biodiversity. And it was the forest owner was planning to chop down the trees, and then he would destroy much of the values there. So, and some NGOs were very active, and we wanted to protect this forest, and we contacted the regional authority where also conservationists employed, and was a lot of communication, a lot of work, a lot of dialogue with the forest owner, and at last the regional authority, they made some negotiations with the owner, and at last we could save this forest
through good communication, basically.
Yeah.
Grant, maybe I can start with you this time. I wanted to ask what advice you would offer to especially young conservationists who may be struggling to achieve their conservation goals. And I think that this is, in this profession, this is maybe more common than in most professions, because generally speaking, conservation is not the strongest department or the biggest focus. So I think very often, especially young conservationists might find themselves in a situation where they seem like they're facing, impossible odds, and that their goals are just going to be really difficult to achieve. So what advice would you offer to people in that situation? And just kind of, if you don't mind, just a second part to that question, to what extent do you think that self-reflection is necessary? Is it sometimes a case of just needing to listen and knowing that we're not necessarily right about wanting to conserve or conserving in the way that we think we should conserve?
For young planners, I think it's important to realize that, as you kind of framed it, that it is a struggle. And give you an anecdote. I had a new supervisor. We had many people. I had one section, and he had a bunch of sections. And he wanted to talk to the staff, and he went to talk to all the staff to see how they were feeling. And then he talked to me, and he said, they all think they lose every day. And he was kind of shocked by that. And I says, yeah, they do every day. And he says, well, what do you mean? Well, we have all, policies, we have direction, we have professional practice, we have science, and yet still that doesn't cover it. And so that is just kind of part of the profession at this point. And if you're in a municipality, that's the case. To keep it in perspective, though, municipalities have to deal with so many issues. Some of them aren't even municipal issues, but they have to, because if nobody else will do it. And so that is part of the tension. So I think that, the advice is, and I do say this to my staff, do good work. Whatever the thing is in front of you, you have to do it to the best of your ability. The work you do does tend to persist, and it may not have the effect you want, but it does add up over time. So I think that's really important. Now, as far as the self-reflection question you had, that's an important one. Like, we should always take some time to reflect on where we're at, what our situation is. Is our goal really helpful to the organization you're working for and the municipality you're working for? But further, I think it's important to look at everybody that you might consider as kind of your adversary, people that are in your way. You feel that they're not getting it. You hear that a lot. They just don't get it. And to really find out what their argument is, like what are they trying to do? What motivates them? I was very lucky to have a professor in university that had said, you'll probably never convince somebody that doesn't agree with your value set or your perspective using arguments from that perspective. You have to learn their perspective and use arguments and tailor it to them. What will make their project successful by incorporating biodiversity? What would a development be better if you considered biodiversity? What if you did something different than you didn't normally do? that will help you go further. And so that does, to me, point to the need for an interdisciplinary education. When I had started, I had education, the background in science and engineering and planning, and I did that purposely. And for quite a while, 10 or 15 years, I thought it was a big mistake because people just naturally from different disciplines do not get together and work together. I must say that is really not the case now. There's still a certain amount of that, but it has evolved quite a bit in that regard. So just, young planners do good work and also learn what makes the other people say what they say. Why are they opposing you? Is there some way you can help them? The other thing I would add is I've always advised my staff is to go into other areas of the city with the attitude is, we're here to help. What do you need? Because environment is scary for many professions, and the environmental professionals and the biodiversity kind of professionals and person assume everybody understands what you're talking about, or else they should. And then it's often coming in near the end and putting in more friction into the whole decision-making process, where we had been more successful to try and get there first and say, look, we've got these people that know how to do this. What are you trying to do? Can we be part of your team? And then you start to shape it from there. And then it's in a better place than trying to patch it up at the end, which was a common way of doing all sorts of environmental planning work.
Have you, especially in communicating like that with colleagues in other departments, have you ever had situations where you've kind of realized that actually they're right, or that you've kind of gone into, not necessarily you in particular, but you or any of your staff have gone into a particular situation with a conservation goal and then have kind of been swung around to their perspective rather than being successful in swinging them around to your perspective?
All the time. And I think that is part of learning what those perspectives are and learning whatever knowledge base that they use. Just as you might be an expert in biodiversity doesn't mean you're an expert in engineering, doesn't mean you're an expert in social planning. So this is why I have come to the conclusion that I really dislike environmental impact assessments. I much more prefer environmental or ecological design, where you get there at the beginning and you say, this is what you need to do. This is how this thing should perform, how this project should perform. And we should start to get some of those things incorporated now to get the better project. I found with the environmental impact assessment, it was like this judging thing at the end, this judging session where you said, yeah, I looked at your work that you spent for the last 2 or 3 years, and yeah, I don't like it. Can you start again? Well, they're not going to start again because they don't have the budget, and now they don't like you. And so you put them in a situation where they have to fight you. Moving it around and getting involved at the beginning of the process has always yielded better results because you have that chance for that conversation, that chance to just understand what are the challenges everybody at the table has to overcome. So I don't know. I think it's controversial for a lot of people, but I've always had better results starting with the end in mind and starting at the beginning.
It's the second time in this conversation that you've said something that reminds me of the South African situation, where this might be a bit outdated, but 10 or 15 years ago, when I knew what was going on in municipal and regional planning there to some extent, there was a very clear distinction made between what they called forward planning and reactive planning. And
Right.
The EIAs would fall very much in the reactive planning category. And then the kind of philosophy was we should aim at a situation where we are only doing forward planning of the kind that you just mentioned, being there from the start and part of the design process, rather than the reactive way of doing things, which is, as you say, kind of, it's too late, right? People they're already attached to the idea, they're invested, and it's so much more difficult to undo anything. Widar, how about you? I'll repeat the question because it's been a while. But what advice would you give to especially young conservationists who are struggling to achieve conservation goals, and when it seems like it's an impossible task? And also, to what extent do you think that self-reflection is necessary in cases like that?
First of all, I recognize what Grant mentioned, and I agree. I could add that we had some 35 students making practices over the years, and we've always tried to support them as much as we could, and to build up their self-esteem by arguments and facts. So telling them that they need to read a lot, and also, as Grant said, to know the other side and their arguments. And as you said, Andre, listen more than you speak. It's very important. One good method, I think, is the Socrates method. You know, the Greek philosopher. He always asked questions. He said himself he didn't know anything, and he got to the oracle in Delphi and asked, "Who is the most wise in Athens?" And the oracle said, "It's you." And the man who claimed he didn't know anything was the wisest. It's because he just asked questions, and he had an issue and collected people and discussed an issue, but he never gave any answer. He just let everybody else making answers, and together that would be the answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so ask questions instead of getting angry and trying to fight too much. Also, I think it's important for young conservationists to build strong networks, contact with other people in other municipalities or regional authorities or whatever, scientists as well, so they can build up good arguments for conservation issues. About self-reflection, of course, you always have to do that, but making wrong, I think, is mostly about when you're doing something that counteracts the politician goals and targets, but it could be right for future generations. Mm-hmm. So for me, I'm always thinking about future generations. So sometimes there have been some conflicts, or even with politicians, but when it's important, I feel I must do it.
I think it's very useful for a young conservationist to get involved in committee work. You know, committees where they're trying to solve a particular problem, and, you know, start with something where everybody sort of thinks the same way, because then you can practice making your arguments. But then you advance to get into committees where people don't agree with what you have to say, and you have to persuade them to move off of their position. And that gets you just better at understanding what resonates with people, how to communicate yourself, how to react when people come on you really harshly. All of that is part of what a professional has to learn. And I've just found that the various committee work has got me a little bit more battle hardened and allowed me to handle a lot of situations that I don't think I would have been able to handle without those number of experiences over the years. And it could be for a new policy. You know, I've been on various wetland policy committees. It could be about flooding. It could be just about any kind of topic. But it's usually when people are trying to get a new policy direction that would, satisfy a number of perspectives, and you're trying to make a move. So that's where you can really find out who your allies are, mm-hmm. where your ideas rub, and that goes back to what you're saying on reflection. If your ideas are rubbing people so harshly, can you change? What can you do about it to be more friendly to those people who are feeling maybe threatened by what you're proposing?
Well, one thing's for sure, people like you too have done a lot more than your fair share in the right direction. And yeah, that's really why I wanted to I wanted to have this discussion not just because you're both kind of in a similar situation, having recently retired and looking back on a long career, but also I've been so disproportionately influenced by both of you and by my interactions with both of you. Partly, there are a few things. One is the way that you've persisted at what you've done over the years. And then I think the other most important thing is the humility with which both of you seem to do the work that you do. And that touches a lot on what we've discussed now about communication. I think that you can be the most brilliant conservation biologist in the world, but if you don't learn how to communicate, and if you don't learn the humility that's needed to communicate well, then it's all for nothing. So I want to thank you not just for coming on the podcast, but for everything that you've done and for all the inspiration. And I know that I'm one of many who can say that. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the kind words, Andre.
Thanks.
Everybody has agency, right? I always say if you get up in the morning, you're going to have an effect on the world.
Many thanks to Widar and Grant for sharing their reflections on their careers and the experiences that they've gathered along the way. Have a look at the episode page of the website at caseforconservation.com. That's case for conservation with the number 4 for links to some relevant resources. Next time, I'll be talking to Quill Robinson, a young conservationist based in Washington, D.C., who spends much of his time in Congress advocating for pragmatic bipartisan policy solutions to environmental challenges. Quill grew up in a typically progressive Seattle family, but now considers himself conservative. We talk about what it means to be liberal or conservative in the environmental sphere and how environmental issues became polarized. See you then.